Thank you, Jonathan. So we've had a really lovely journey today in our conversation, and Cheryl just at the end brought us back to people. So where do we start? And it's with people, whether we're people in the system or we're people receiving support in the system, we are still people. So I think what we talked about was the fact that if you start with these sorts of challenges, and the one that we were thinking about was how you create an environment where our ageing population is supported as independently as possible, hopefully with cooperative principles and values at the heart of that. You can either do it strategically from the bottom up and say how do leaders cooperate together to create the environment to then enable the workforce to deliver differently with people at the heart of everything they do, and the ad will come in a minute, you can possibly create the environment by trusting that workforce to try things differently and create the trust in those teams. So the challenge that we had was in home care and district nursing and reablement, we think there are people going into people's homes and duplicating, and the workforce aren't necessarily that happy or valued or well paid in all of those roles. So if we could break that a bit, where would we start to create that environment of cooperation for the workers? And then how would that lead upwards rather than downwards, I think was a key takeaway for me. And another challenge that came was investment. So are we thinking about the pound of health and care budgets that go into supporting people as just money that goes in and we get some benefit from, but it's gone in that moment? Or are we thinking about the circular nature of that, and with some additional added investment in, how could you then create the environment where people then reinvest that? So those people being the leaders of organisations and that structure of cooperation. And I say structure because that was another thing that we got quite exercised about. So do you need a kind of structural solution to some of this to create the partnership, or do you need the willingness and the values and the commitment to start the partnership and then think about what the structures are that flow from that? Because we're quite entrenched in some of our structures, and if we start from that, that might be the barrier to the conversation about the principles of how we want to work together. So the investment, the structures, the relationships, and the role of workers and people in influencing how a partnership could work were some really interesting conversations that we had. And I feel like we unlocked a few things that we at the start of the day were really struggling to grasp in terms of concepts that would then become a different reality. It was all about people and relationships first, and how do you create that environment from the bottom up rather than the top down, because sometimes in our leadership mindsets we get stuck with the constraints of the structures that we have rather than thinking about the purpose that we're here for, and then other ways of working flowing from that. Hopefully that's an understandable summary.
Thank you, Lisa. That's great. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you. So thank you to everyone who really participated in this. It was a really great conversation we had. I mean, the first reflection is poor Jamie. I don't think Eddie or I are ever going to win a handwriting competition, so it's something quite difficult to unravel here. But I think a number of things kind of came across. It was interesting that we were focusing on growing the social economy, and particularly in Oldham, and we started from the start really to go to the local authority and the public sector and see that as a solution with some of our thinking, and actually we quickly came away from that and started to think much more widely about the challenges that are playing out. There's a big temptation when you talk about challenges in growing the social economy around money. It is huge, and it did repeat throughout. But I think one of the things that I've taken away is actually it's not necessarily about more money, it's about how that money is utilised, it's about where it goes, who thinks about that, and the way in which all that's brought together into something that's more cohesive. We talked a lot about strategy, and there needs to be leadership from the top, and it being very much part of every decision. You know, how is this going to impact on our aspiration to grow the social economy? But that really needed to be forced through all the structures, but also brought up, as you said, from the bottom, because I think that's where more of the power needs to lie in the future if we have aspirations to really grow a sustainable, resilient social economy in places in Oldham in this case. We talked a lot about time and how long this stuff takes and how much that strategy is to recognise that this is a long term. I think we had a lot of examples. I personally reflected on beginning my career when New Deal for Communities, those of you that have been around a while, was launched, and it was 10-year money, and I thought this is amazing, it's going to be transformational, and 10 years went in the blink of an eye, and actually we're talking about generations of decline that need to be matched by money for the same kinds of periods. So a lot of talk about how this needs to be long term. We also talked about the other actors, the private sector in particular, and its role in enabling the social economy to grow, the fact that it does have a strong role to play in places, that it can bring capital, it can bring expertise, it can bring opportunities, and it can be part of a much wider mix. But also the community in terms of individuals in communities, and not just community organisations, and how might we be able to unlock the passion that people have. So we're not just thinking about structures and organisations, we're actually thinking about active citizens within a community and being part of that wider social economy. There's obviously major challenges with risk, with I guess people being stuck in those systems, in that conventional thinking. We can't do that. Again, something that we talked about was COVID, and how actually it just removed barriers. So people can do things quickly, they can do things outside of restricted systems, but actually you need to enable that, and I think that goes back to that strategy point.
Thank you, Matt. And over to you, Rachel.
Hi, yes, so our brief was talking around Croydon have a large proportion of adults with learning disabilities in care homes. So that was our brief, but then we went on a whole transformational journey and talked about kind of a little bit of everything. But first and foremost, what I think was really poignant with, it's a market-driven place, is Croydon, so they're almost beholden to the providers within the area. So predominantly, services are delivered by the private sector. It doesn't feel like a partnership, it feels like they're kind of dictating the market. We talked about residential services and supported living services, and I think what Croydon have done over the last several months is the providers in Croydon, they were delivering the care and support, and they were also delivering they had the accommodation, so they almost had the Croydon over a barrel. So what Croydon have been doing is splitting the care and support element and also the housing element, and with a view of putting the care and support element out to tender so they can have a rich and diverse market. So they've got, like I said, they've got very few VCSE providers in the sector. It's all sort of privately driven. And we talked about when you get that rich and diverse marketplace, then potentially you could look at different housing options, because at the minute there's just supported living, like I said, residential. You could potentially look at own front door accommodation, so getting the third sector in and looking at using their reserves potentially to develop own front door accommodation. We talked about asset transfer, and I know that Tracy's in the room who worked with me on an asset transfer. We were best friends at the end of it, we didn't fall out. So Rochdale transferred some land to PossAbilities, and we developed some own front door accommodation using our reserves. There's no reason why that can't happen in Croydon. We talked about shared lives and doing sort of an investor save. So they have a small shared life service in Croydon, would you say, is that right? And how you would look at developing that arrangement because it is cost effective and has some amazing outcomes. And we talked about many more things, but it would probably take half a day to go through. We did talk a lot about my favourite word, which is disruption. So
Thank you, Rachel. So I suppose just one or two points that came up from some of the discussions that perhaps have either a general or a specific application. But one of the things was about how do we get stakeholders to speak the same language? Because that's really important if we're really going to try and understand what's needed and make things clear. So how do you make that happen in Greenwich?
Oh, that's a really important subject that we talked about in terms of language, because we talked about the culture as well that is driven by some of that language difference. So if you look at the example that Emma used as the equal care co-op, where you've got different hats, those different actors will come at that relationship between somebody's care and support and the roles that they play, potentially from different disciplines, from different organisations. But actually what they're doing is trying to coalesce around somebody in the language that is important to them. The environment that we talked about for that, though, was about people coming with the value base and the cooperative values and principles at the heart of why they're at the table. So if we talk about who we are as the heart of it, again, back to people, we talked about then the simple language. So the example around language that Emma brought in was somebody said, how do these teams work? And we said, let's have 5 minutes before we break for lunch and see how these teams work. So somebody said, how do those teams start? And what role are those teams, team members, to start things up? And Emma said, a team starter. So it's really about simple language, and that, you know, what would the starter of a team in a district nursing team be versus a starter of a team in a home care organisation be, or a starter of a team in a reablement team be? Well, a team starter. So I think it was almost like an aha moment, really, in that we get caught up in our institutional language. If I have to translate an NHS speak from a board meeting to a social worker, I'll have to take a step back and remember that I'm not going to use the acronyms that I would have used. And actually putting people at the heart of it meant that we were using language that actually wasn't institutional. So just that team starter bit for me was a really important thing. If you then translated that from the workers that are working around a person into a partnership environment, and we just checked in on each other, we were using human-centred language, I think relationships could be a bit different.
And Matt, social impact investment, all the different language that we have around that, how does that link with what commissioners might understand?
That's a nice easy one, thank you. I think it's so social investment has invented a language of its own, clearly, that it's adapted from the wider investment world. And I guess, we were talking about definitions and what is in a social enterprise or a social economy organisation. There's a million different definitions. Clearly, none of this is helpful to having good quality conversations. I think, it is grounded in the people, it is grounded in, the shared understanding of what you're trying to achieve and being very clear about that. I do think these things are about spending time, actually trying to get to know and understand where each other's coming from, trying to find that shared narrative that actually this is what we really mean, rather than the complex side of the language actually cut it back right down to what is it this is all about. But it isn't easy, and without that, I think interactions are poorer across the piece, and I think it's something that does trip us up a lot, and we need to be thoughtful of that.
And Rachel, have you got any thoughts on this?
So we talked about people being experts in their own care, around real co-production, so people know what they need in their lives, and they know, what their service should look like. And we also talked about the power of storytelling. So there's nothing more powerful than a story. So you can read as many reports as you want, and it can sometimes be really dry, but that real human element of telling a story and how something's made a difference in people's lives, I think, is really important.
Thank you. And coming back to the comments about Croydon and sort of being very trapped in the market, and how do you kind of move away from the market? And I know from conversations in other places where things are kind of locked in, but you want to innovate and do things differently, and you almost need a kind of parallel process or some parallel funding to be able to make some new things happen. How could that work in your context, Lisa?
We talked about who investors could be or should be, and there was a really important challenge from Emma about, she's put ideas to councils about could they invest their own funds as part of this sort of circular arrangement of putting some investment in, expecting some payback on that for social good. As a cooperative council, I think Emma and Cheryl quite rightly put the challenge to me in the role that I'm in, that actually we have a responsibility for thinking about the total place investment that we put in. So we could be that actor, but we didn't necessarily have to be, because if you ended up in a partnership where a number of organisations could see themselves as investors as well as deliverers and receiving the money that goes into that pot from health and care budgets and people's own investment. I think the other thing that came out of this is that care isn't free in this country. So when people are paying for their care, they're investing in that relationship as much as the public purse. Obviously at different levels depending on how much they have to pay. But that means that actually the money question becomes a collective investment rather than one organisation being seen as the one that needs to put the money in. And I think on the point about private organisations, I think we came back to the fact that it isn't about necessarily the legal form, it's about the principles and values and, an acceptable profit margin for a private organisation, and that being transparent and us seeing some investment in the workforce. If those principles and values are aligned, that isn't an inherently bad thing. But if we have got more purpose-aligned organisations that are explicitly, so one of them on our table was talking about as a social business, they do explicitly invest, but at the moment do it in one way, but could in this sort of partnership do it more strategically to do that kind of capacity building type investment. That would be a different mindset. So we got into a lot about those sorts of, what do you use the money for and who puts it in, and actually is the value-based organisation the one, or the legal form the important bit of it. So quite technical.
Yeah. Probably getting even more technical. I know you get money from lots of different places and most of it has to go back. So how can social investors play a part in being able to support innovation and moving from what we're doing now to the kind of future and what we might want to do tomorrow?
So again, we did actually discuss this, and I think we had quite a techy conversation. Apologies for we lost anyone on the table. I think there is a real gap for risk money within social investment. I think it's something that's very difficult to fund, particularly with the majority being repayable, as you say. I also think it's a bit of a challenge within the commercial sector as well. I think genuine risk money is hard to get hold of. There are some interesting moves. There are people doing interesting things in different places. There's a lot of work on enterprise development grants that Access has been heavily involved in, that I think has a lot of promise to be able to fund that risk money to give people time, space, and a risk-free or a low-risk basis to try new approaches and to pilot and to work things forward. But it is a major gap. There are other sources that I don't think we make enough of. So we talked about private individuals and paying for care. Crowdfunding is a really powerful tool, both to bring people into a new development and also to test it almost. If somebody's willing to put You know, if it's only £15, still, you know, if someone's willing to put some money into an idea, that to some extent shows us a demand for that. They believe that it would be successful. Also, we talked about community shares being a powerful mechanism for raising funds in a different way. But there are also, you know, we talked about corporates and the fact that sometimes there is a CSR angle that's attractive. So I think there are sources, but there doesn't seem to be a sector response quite yet to providing that kind of money to help people to make those first risky steps forward.
And Rachel, I know as an absolutely purpose-driven organisation that's been quite successful and has generated profits that then you've reinvested in doing some innovative things. Do you want to just share something on that?
Yeah, so we built 17 apartments in Rochdale for vulnerable adults. We knew there was a need, people wanted their own front door accommodation. So we approached the local authority. We didn't have any money, by the way. We were a spin out from the local authority. We had no money in the bank, we didn't have any land, we'd never built anything before. But we thought, well, that's not going to stop us. So we approached the local authority. We asked them to loan us some money to build 17 apartments, which they did through the Public Works Loan Board, and the asset transferred some land to us, and we developed 17 apartments. They're pretty full. We get calls every week for people wanting to potentially have a place. So we're looking at building 17 more in Rochdale. We bought some land and we're using our reserves to build those apartments. We're also bought some land in Runcorn, so we're looking at building 19 apartments in Runcorn, and we're having a conversation with Bradford around a plot of land that we've seen, all for own front door accommodation. So we're using our reserves to sort of invest in the local community to build things that people want.
So there are ways and means. The issue is, how can we scale things up? How do we really make change happen on a much bigger scale? And for that, you know, we need the collective interest and work of everybody in this room, and we need people to take notice, like Andy Burnham, who was here last night, or people from government. And we've had a few people from DCLS observing today who are taking ideas back to pop into the comprehensive spending review. But really we need a much bigger and more kind of serious understanding of what can be done from government to really unlock things. And as we heard earlier from Julian and Sandra, there's been some kind of positive moves from the Cabinet Office in relation to the approach to public procurement and social value, but we know that a lot of this goes way beyond procurement. It's about a kind of mindset shift in what people and communities really need, and the kind of leadership to make that happen. So, as I mentioned earlier, I know a number of people have got to leave to get trains, some people have already gone, so I don't want to kind of drag things out. But I do want to kind of take this last little moment to say one or two things, really, to thank people. So first of all, thank you to my panellists here for agreeing to come up and being asked awkward questions. I'd like to thank all of our vignette speakers who've kind of gone out of their way, and particularly Joe, who's still here, and James has had to go, who had to kind of do it absolutely at the last minute, so that was great. For our table challenge leads, who've come up with the ideas for the things that you've been working on, I sincerely hope you found it useful and you've got some things to take back, and we're going to share that. And for all our table supporters from the kind of E3M partners, and particularly to thank Stone King and Buzzicott and Zurich, our partners, but particularly Stone King for helping make this event happen, and for Better Society Capital and the Lloyds Bank Foundation, and to Shelley and the marketing team at Stone King, and my colleague Claire, who's up the back there. You wouldn't be here without Claire, so thank you so much, Claire. And for the People's History Museum. Isn't this just a brilliant venue? It really is. So a big round of applause and a big thank you to everyone.